Welcome to the library. I'm Dwayne Cox, head of Special Collections and Archives. This lecture today is sponsored by the College of Agriculture and Experiment Station. It's sponsored by the University Libraries, the Sesquicentennial Committee, the Center for Arts and Humanities. Have I missed anybody? I don't think so. A couple of procedural things. One, there's a reception after the lecture and there's food. So that's in the room behind the reference desk, so you're all invited to attend that. In that room are several copies of this book that was written by our speakers today, and I understand they're for sale for $10. Is that right? And if you twist the author's arms, they'll probably autograph a copy of it for you. I need to also tell the speakers that we're filming the lecture today, and they know that. But Gary Hawkins, our cinematographer and expert on such things, who's doing the filming and the wiring and the sound, would ask the speakers not to range too far from the lectern. If they do, they'll get out of the scope of his camera. And then finally, if you have questions at the end, go to the microphone so they can be picked up and recorded for posterity. Finally, I'm honored to be able to introduce these two gentlemen in this subject. One of the top things that has made America great is our ability to feed ourselves. And so many people take that for granted. So many Americans take it for granted. You can be sure that the majority of the people in the world don't take it for granted. But we have excelled in that. If you look back in history, and if you look at the countries of the world, we're, if not unique, we're very unusual in that and fortunate in that. So I'm pleased to be able to introduce this lecture for that reason. I'm pleased to be able to introduce the speakers because they spent a lot of time in special collections writing this book. They were extremely diligent. Now and then I could get Gene Stevenson to stop and talk to me, but Joe Yeager, he was like the man behind the plow. He had his eye on the fence post at the other end of the field, and he didn't look either way. He just kept going. And then finally, I want to introduce Richard Guthrie, who is the Dean of Agriculture and head of the Experiment Station. That's true, right? The $6 million man. So without further ado, I give you your speakers, Joe Yeager and Gene Stevenson. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. Appreciate that introduction, and I certainly appreciate all of your coming out this afternoon. I know you've got things to do other than listen to two old college professors. This is quite an occasion, certainly. The money from the books, Dwayne, goes for Heritage Park now. Originally, we had it set up for a scholarship, and we had the scholarship fully funded. In other words, we sold $25,000 worth of books at $25, 1,000 books at $25 a piece. And now the money goes for Heritage Park. So we appreciate your interest in buying the books. I'm going to talk a little, and I certainly can't go into a lot of detail because we simply don't have the time, about the College of Agriculture itself. Well, going back to the Morrill Act very briefly, although we've already had a lecture really on that, and the Experiment Station, and then a few other comments that I see fit to make. My first experience with Auburn, coming to Auburn, was in 1927. My folks from Cullman had been to, and I was with them. There were two kids and my mother and father. Went to Atlanta, actually Douglasville, Georgia, just outside of Atlanta, to see some of the Yeager kinfolks. We were traveling in a Model T Ford, and we drove from Atlanta, outside of Atlanta, to in front of Sanford Hall, and we stopped. My kinfolks in Atlanta, Yeager kinfolks, had packed a lunch for us. And apparently the lady that packed it used liberal portions of dill pickles. And the lunch was placed under the floorboard of the Model T car that we were traveling in. When we pulled up in front of Sanford Hall, we ate lunch. I remember an iron fence, although I'm not sure whether we pulled off. I know there was an iron fence in front of where General Lane's house was, but we ate lunch right there in front of Sanford Hall. I came to Auburn as a freshman in 1939. I traveled from Cullman to Highway 280, and it wasn't paved from Alexander City to Auburn, and I think they're still working on parts of that road. The closer we got to Auburn, my father, being tied to agriculture, although he was in education, commented, why in the world did they ever locate the agricultural experiment station here at Auburn? It looked to be the poorest land there is in the state. But anyway, so you see, I'm rather aged, old. I hope you don't think I'm ancient anyway, but I graduated in 43 and military service, 46 to 48, got my master's, came back to Purdue in 51. So I've been here continuously since 1951, which if my math is correct is about, will be, 55 years as of July the 1st. Actually, present-day Auburn University owes its existence to the Morrill Act, the Land-Grant College Act of 1862, which authorized agricultural and mechanical colleges in each state. Thanks to the Methodists, as you heard in Dr. Wayne Flint's lecture, the Methodists got into trouble financially with two churches, one here in Auburn, one in Greensboro, Old Southern University, and they donated the land to the state about the time or shortly after the Morrill Act was passed, and it was used to establish the land-grant college here in Auburn. That was 1872. It consisted of Old Main, which of course is now Sanford Hall, 200 acres of land, 13 of which the college stood, and 75 acres lying about 3/4 of a mile southwest of the building. The 75 acres were donated by the citizens of Auburn for use as an experimental farm. The first meeting of the board of directors was called in 1872. There was controversy that arose. Actually, there were 51 members on that board of directors, comparable to our board of trustees. Think if we had 51 members today, how much fun we could have in controversy. The 1872 Agricultural and Mechanical College had 101 students enrolled, with 43 in agriculture. There was an 8-position faculty. The president, of course, was I.T. Titchener. He was a noted Baptist minister, even though it grew out of a Methodist school. The following were the faculty positions: president and professor of moral philosophy, logic, history, rhetoric, and political economy, professor of pure mathematics, professor of natural sciences, embracing astronomy, metallurgy, mechanic arts, civil engineering, professor of chemistry proper, agricultural, analytical, geology, and mineralogy, professor of ancient and modern languages, professor of English language and literature, professor of practical agriculture, horticulture, and pomology, commandant and teacher of military tactics and military engineering. You can see from that, that's far different from the types of faculty, the qualifications that we have today. It was primarily classics and liberal arts that was taught in a college that grew out of a college that was preparing preachers. The concept of the Morrill Act, 1862, which was put forward by Justin Morrill of Vermont in the national legislature, by some historians is considered really revolutionary in terms of changing the teaching and the educational philosophy. And it's my opinion that we owe much to the foresight of those who promoted the Morrill Act and got it enacted, Some have compared it to the GI Bill, but others believe that it's more far-reaching. The GI Bill simply made possible education, whereas the Morrill Act changed the philosophy and ideology, we can say, of teaching at that time. Now, some brief comments on the development of research. An experimental farm, as required under the Act, was started in the first year by the board. President Tichenor noted that the leading, making agriculture the leading interest of the college represented formidable difficulties, since men of letters, such as usually compose college faculties, rarely have any knowledge of or taste for agricultural pursuits. Actually, there was a lot of prejudice against book farming, as it was called, and I guess some of that prejudice still exists today. But anyway, agricultural programs were to be based on science, and research was necessary, of course, to back it up. The research and subject matter simply did not exist at the time. Tichenor, and what I've learned about him, wasn't really too strong. He was a little more interested in demonstration than he was in really scientific research. And it wasn't until Leroy Brown, I call it Brown, actually some authorities call it Bruin, but when I was a student having classes in Brown Hall, we called it Brown. He was named president in 1882 and succeeded Tichenor. Brown's academic background was in physics and mathematics, so he brought a little more of a scientific basis for the experiment station. Then in 1884, David French Boyd became president. There was decreased emphasis. Am I touching something? There was a decreased emphasis on the classics and literature. Boyd came up, or the students and the faculty, I guess, with this decreased emphasis on the classics and literature, they were afraid that many of the faculty would leave, and the saying came about, to Alabama, for instance, Tuscaloosa for the classics, and to Auburn for the techniques. The first experiment station director was J.S. Newman. He helped set the course for research in scientific agriculture. Newman published experiment station bulletins, and in one of his first bulletins, he made what I consider a really significant statement, and I quote, "The bane of our agriculture has been a disposition on the part of investigators in the field of agricultural experiment to draw conclusions and announce them as facts before they are definitely ascertained. This will be as far as possible will not be done at this station." And I think that's been followed through with all our directors of the experiment station, that we've had sound bases before reports were published. Well, there were really problems in early years, as have existed in more recent years. Salaries were low. The college was in debt. Tichenor's salary, the first president, was $2,500 per year. There were 7 other professors that were paid only $1,750 per year. Of course, the cost of living index is far different, and the price level is certainly far different. But they were early struggles. In fact, there was a few reports in the 30s, this is later on, that the college had to borrow money to send out its mail. I don't think they had to do it at that time. In spite of all these difficulties and shortage of funds, there were some outstanding researchers in the experiment station. I'll name only a few and some of the things that they did. P.H. Mell, for whom the Mell Street was named, he collected a specimen of plants that were housed in Sanford Hall. Agriculture was in Sanford Hall, of course, at that time. He taught meteorology and developed a system of flags used by railway stations. The telegraph office was usually located in the railway station, and the system of flags would signal the weather, different positions of the flag, to forecast or tell ahead what the weather was going to be like. Charles A. Carey, you remember him as the Dean of Veterinary Medicine, but he was in agriculture to begin with. He was a teacher of physiology and veterinary medicine. in the agricultural curriculum in 1893. He later became Dean of Veterinary Medicine. Carey headed up Auburn's first research efforts known as Farmers Institute. In fact, he held sessions on Saturday morning in front of Sanford Hall in those trees and got farmers together and tried to teach them about control of ticks and cattle and those types of things. John F. Duggar, he was a pioneer researcher in cotton and legumes. He originated, of course, the old rotation that still is on the historical registry. It was originated in 1896. Duggar came to Auburn in 1895 and was director of the experiment station from 1903 to 21. There was a tremendous amount of research carried on at that time in cotton in the early 1900s and late 1800s. In fact, cotton was the crop in Alabama at that time. As I recall, in 1911, there were 3,800,000 acres of cotton in Alabama. Today, there's approximately 500,000. But he spent a lot of time on cotton, and of course, he encouraged his researchers to carry out many experiments on cotton. This is Bulletin 107. I know you can't see it, but if you'd like to look at it afterwards, it was a compilation of all the research on cotton from 1883 to 1900. It was submitted to the World's Fair in Paris in 1900 and won a silver medal. There are some interesting photographs in here of cotton fibers. They're called photomicrographs, and the single cotton fiber is a single cell, and it's amazing that they could do photography at that time that would pick up such as that. Bennett Battle Ross, for whom Ross Laboratories was named. It's, of course, being renovated now. He was professor of agricultural chemistry and state chemist beginning in 1893. He became Dean of Agriculture. In fact, Richard, he was the first Dean of Agriculture in 1908 when they designated a Dean for Agriculture separately. The story is told that Ross, in his early years, went to Germany to look at some of the work they were doing. I believe it was Berlin, although he probably visited other cities in Germany. And he was handed a textbook, and the person handing him the book, "Are you familiar with any of these textbooks, this textbook in specifically?" And Dean Ross, or Dr. Ross's reply was, "I think I know a little something about it. I happen to be the author of this textbook." Many other outstanding faculty. I could go on, but time doesn't permit. Briefly on the curriculum and its development. The Articles of Admission for the college, published in 1873, made it clear that agriculture and engineering were the cornerstone study areas. Then in 1874, 4 courses of study were offered: letters and science, agriculture, and engineering. In 1875-76, the course in agriculture leading to a Bachelor of Agriculture degree embraced French, German, botany, chemistry, mathematics, surveying and leveling, political economy, which economics grew out of, and lessons in practical agriculture. Can you imagine some of our students taking some of those courses? Before 1875-76, only the Bachelor of Arts degree was offered. In 1914-15, there were 3 professors in agriculture: J.F. Duggar, M.J. Funches, whom I knew. I'd seen Duggar. Funches was known as Fax Funches. F.E. Boyd. They taught the following courses, and I'll give you some of them here. Freshman, Introduction to Agriculture, give you a little taste of the curriculum. Sophomore, Corn, Small Grains, Farm Accounts. Junior, Drainage, Terracing, Farm Structures. Leguminous, Forage Plants, and Soil Improvement. Senior year, Cotton, Cotton Classing, Farm Management, Soils Laboratory, Special Crops, and Farm Machinery. Field Operations and Farm Machinery. Methods of Teaching Agriculture. Investigation as a basis for a thesis. Funches left his class roll book in the dean's office, and I happened to obtain it. It meticulously shows the class roll. You probably can't see them, but surprisingly, we're up to 100 students in some of those classes. But the interesting thing, the reason I was very much interested in it, is the note in the front of it here It says on the night of October the 17th, 1920, the agricultural building was destroyed by fire, and all previous to this date, all materials previous to this date were lost. It's interesting that that fire, Mr. J.C. Lyer, one of the old-time extension persons, told me that he was here at that time. In fact, his name is listed in here, but I wasn't here at that time. He told me that there were some students housed in the third floor Comer, and that when the building burned, the students carefully carried the books down the stairs and threw the typewriters out the windows. I guess that might be somewhat typical of college students. Over time, departments were formed. Early ones in 1908 were agriculture, which became agronomy, animal industry, botany, horticulture, and entomology. Agricultural engineering was formed in 1916, rural organization, farm management 1921, poultry husband 47, fisheries and allied aquaculture in 1970. Well, the agricultural curriculum developed. Agricultural science was the mainstay over time, I might say. As departments grew, certainly more specialization occurred. I checked one of the recent bulletins. We've got quite a few curricula today in agriculture. And our students have grown to some extent and then declined. I won't go into the detail there, but at one time in the 1960s, we reached a peak of 1,727 students. Well, it was later than that. It was in 1977 and 78. I believe it was between 800 and 900 today. The first female in agriculture was Frances Duggar, Frances Camp Duggar. Some of you old-timers remember her. She used to ride a bicycle in town, and she taught at kindergarten. Very briefly on the research. The Hawkins Bill was passed early it was 1883. And this was a tax on fertilizer. All different ingredients, some not really fertility materials, were used in fertilizer back at that time. So they had to do something about it to get some quality control in the fertilizer. The Hawkins Bill put a tax on fertilizer and inspection, of course, and the experiment station got some of the money for that, and also the Department of Agriculture. The experiment station farm was formed, as I indicated, in 1883. It was described as generally run down, although there were quite a number of experiments carried out on that farm. And it's interesting, some of the first bulletins were published by the Commissioner of Agriculture. The reference library for agriculture was first in Sanford Hall. When I was a student in the 40s, it was in Comer Hall, and then it was changed to Mary Martin Hall, and of course now it's in this beautiful building, although not separate, designated separately as Ag Library. Our outlying branch stations were developed. There was a need on the different soil types in the state to have representation and quality work to represent those areas. The Hatch Act was passed. It provided funds for agricultural research, and it's been modified over a period of time, which broadened the areas of work in which we could do research, including health and welfare of people, promote sound and prosperous agriculture in rural life. The first 5 substations were established in the major physiographic areas of the state. The Tennessee Valley at Belmina, the Sand Mountain substation at Crossville, the Black Belt substation at Marion Junction, the Wiregrass substation at Headland, and the Gulf Coast substation at Fairhope, Alabama. These, of course, have been modified over time. Fields have been added, and specialized units have been added. I mentioned some of the early leaders in agriculture. Two that I did not mention, Mark Nichols, although he was more with the soil dynamics, called Soil Dynamics Lab. His work on soil erosion was very important. C.E. Easter in the areas of agricultural engineering or rural electrification were very important. W.D. Salman was an outstanding leader in animal science. He developed a dog food that was dry that could be fed and used in research with dogs and beagles. He discovered vitamin G, which The lack of it causes pellagra, and he was instrumental in getting a bill through the legislature to fortify cornmeal and grits and so on. He did a heck of a lot of work on choline deficiency, which is tied to cancer. There are others that I will skip. Some of them I certainly hate to, but time is running out on me. I mentioned a little about the Great Depression, what effect it had. It was somewhat devastating. The college in 1936, for example, received only 33% of its appropriation. Lack of funds made teaching and research difficult. John Goodman, a poultry faculty member, reported paying $4 per month for a room in a house located where the former Heart of Auburn motel was located. Dean Smith, I believe, said that the Depression brought people together. They got to know each other better because of the Depression. Tuition, I'm ashamed to tell you what tuition was back in 1920-21. It was $12.50 a semester, $5.50 for laundry, $9 and a contingent deposit for $5. The out-of-state tuition was $18 per semester. Inflation has taken its toll. I'll comment just a little on some of the buildings. Comer Hall, for example, our mainstay in agriculture. If you notice the cornices on the partial columns, there are grapes, I believe, there in sheep's horns or ram's horns, and there's a lack of cotton on those. I suppose the architect didn't realize how important cotton was. Comer Hall was also important because the radio station, the forerunner of WAPI, WMAU, or something like that, started out there. I mentioned the fire in Comer Hall. It was rebuilt in 1922. They brought in a 50,000-gallon, or built a 50,000-gallon water tank there, hoping to prevent it. Brought in a hangar from Taylor Field in Montgomery for ag engineering, and so on. Well, there are other buildings, but I'll conclude because my time is limited, or I'll knock Gene out of most of his. Agriculture is a proud history and a rich tradition. The dedication, loyalty, and hard work of people who have been a part of Auburn over the years have been responsible for the success attained. The new century has brought many challenges, some similar to those of the past, but of a different magnitude and a different economic, environmental, political, and social setting. Auburn's agricultural legacy has been in knowledge and experience, patience and dedication to change and make improvements, the desire to teach and inform, and an awareness of man's critical part in the universe. Our future will depend on our willingness to change to become an even more effective institution in meeting the needs of people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. I can't compete with Dr. Yeager's trip to Auburn in a Model A Ford in 1927, but my 1947 trip down here to enroll at Alabama Polytechnic Institute, I seem to have gained on his age those years in between. And finally, I think we're about the same age, Joe. And I guess it's a good thing that we were in that age group together. The story was when Dean James Marion signed us up to work on the history of Auburn, which we called Inside Ag Hill. He was looking for somebody that remembered most of it. And so I claimed as many years as I could. Joe had enough, and together we worked on that. We decided to start with that people were the important things in agriculture at Auburn and all of Auburn. That's when students got together to talk about their college days, they always talked about their professors and the weird habits they had and their teaching style. So we thought we would use that and spend much of our time talking about these people who had meant so much to the university. Now, we've started with one short section that soon became our favorite. It's called Legends of Ag Hill. And we got the names of these people in our interviews with old-timers around here. Everybody seemed to remember the same ones, so we followed through on that. Now, we kept the list of legends short by self-imposed restrictions that no living legends be included. Some of the tales we were going to tell didn't need to be told with the subject being able to hear it. And we wanted to be able to write with candor about those we did. But leaving out living legends meant that people like John Goodman, who taught poultry husbandry courses from 1932 to 1972, and who celebrated his 100th birthday just a few weeks back at Good Old Boys, would be left out. I really regretted this omission, since it prevented use of the tough old professor's description name of Chicken Goodman, which was widely quoted by students at that time, but they are quick to tell you they didn't call him Chicken Goodman because he taught poultry. Some of you guys will pick up on that in a minute. And neither do the names of such people as Arthur W. Cooper, who's with us today, and M.J. Danner appear among the legends, even though their time as teachers here goes back to around 1939 and 1942, respectively. And they're both are regularly seen around town at various public events, providing a bridge to an Auburn of bygone years. Arthur, we're glad you're with us today. Our realistic discussion of agricultural personalities dating back to the beginnings of Alabama A&M College would begin in 1872, but with one who might not be recognized as an ag man by many of you, Isaac Taylor Tishner. Tishner became the first president of the college on March 22, 1872, but before the year was out, he received the additional duties of professor of agriculture, which he held until 1879. Now, the very first professor of agriculture was W.H. Jemison, a Tuscaloosa native, graduate of Princeton, who was named chair of practical agriculture, horticulture, and pomology at the Board of Directors organizational meeting March 22, 1872. 8 months later, the board abolished his job and replaced it with a position known as professor of agriculture and named Tishner to that post. That left Jemison with a dubious distinction of being the first ag faculty member to be laid off. Now, Auburn's Methodist roots may have been firmly established in the short East Alabama Male College beginnings, but Tishner quickly substituted his Baptist practices and personality. The Civil War hero, who had not only served as a chaplain, but also was recognized as a combat hero who shot his share of Yankees, was a noted theologian who filled Auburn's First Baptist pulpit on many occasions during his 10 years at the college. A stained glass window in the entryway at Auburn Baptist today recognizes his service to that church before he left in 1882 to become secretary of the Baptist Home Mission Board in Atlanta. A quick jump ahead to 1892, the year when Auburn fielded its first ever football team, turns the spotlight on a multi-talented professor of botany named George F. Atkinson. Although Atkinson was on the faculty only from 1889 until 1892, he is remembered as being the first in a string of outstanding botanists on the Auburn faculty. Enough so that his name was given to a disease-resistant tomato variety developed by Walter Greenleaf and released in 1966. Not only is this variety still grown widely after 40 years, but it's provided the gene pool for sources of other varieties that are still grown for both commercial and home garden use. Now, I'd be shorting Atkins' reputation if I didn't call attention to the historic picture of Auburn's first football team and point out that the professor is pictured as assistant coach to the legendary head coach George Petrie. If you see that picture, look at the back. Atkinson, the tall guy in the derby hat, standing in the middle of the back row. Also arriving on the plains with football in 1892 was Charles Carey, who's Joe has already mentioned. But I have to add another reason why he is remembered. He was a genuine character who is still the subject of tales that have been passed down through the generations. One such tale relates how Dr. Carey and a laborer were re-roofing his house. Disagreement broke out between the two, a little altercation, and then Professor Carey fell off the roof, broke his leg. He refused the services of a medical doctor, insisting that the break be set by a veterinarian. The story is he lived the rest of his life because of that decision. Although John F. Duggar was not the first director of the Alabama Experiment Station, which had been established in 1883, his name is synonymous with Auburn agricultural research. But legends are not immune to firing, and Duggar was forced out of his director's job in 1921. But he continued as research professor in farm management and special investigations until his death in 1945. Because of their long tenured careers, plus their unforgettable personalities, the names of D.G. Sturkey and F.E. Guyton span the memory banks of students from around 1920 until the late 1960s. Dr. Sturkey, a professor of agronomy in soils, was here from 1918 to 1968 on faculty, a full 50 years. He's remembered for his excellent teaching and research related to field crops and turf grasses. But most of all, he's remembered as for his teaching styles and mannerisms. Sturkey was rather caustic in his dealings with students. You'd think they might be expected to be alienated by that, but not so. Those who suffered such personal insults counted them as a badge of honor and repeated the tale for years to come. One student who later became superintendent of the Upper Coastal Plains substation up northwest Alabama remembered receiving a quiz grade of 0 from the doc. When he asked, "Did I really deserve a 0?" Sturkey's response said, "No, but the college doesn't allow me to give any lower grades than that." Guyton became a legend largely because of his approach to teaching economic entomology, a course required of all Auburn ag students. But his reputation spread across the entomology discipline. Every student was required to collect and mount 100 specified species of insects according to very strict standards, and mounting was not allowed until Guyton had approved each individual specimen. Rejected ones were thrown away, which meant collecting 100 acceptables could lead to collecting 200 or 300 specimens, or even more if you're a little bit careless. But Guyton was lauded by the Journal of Economic Entomology at his retirement and credited with teaching 15,000 students during his 1921 to 63 tenure. Now, I suppose enough time has passed that it's okay to tell about Guyton's use of bee sting therapy to treat arthritis for local residents and people across the state who came here looking for relief. To fully understand the treatment, you need to visualize placing a honeybee at the proper place on the student, on the patient, and squeezing or whatever necessary to be sure they stung the person at the right time and for purpose. But let me give him credit. He began this method with the help of a local MD. This MD actually believed in the treatment, but he didn't want to be called a quack for practicing that kind of medicine. But he did help Prof do it. Now, the records of M.J. Funches and E.V. Smith as dean and director clearly reflect a long tenure of top administrative officers in agriculture during much of the 20th century. Funches served in the post from 1924 until 1950, and Smith followed from 1951 to 1972. Now, that was in a time when that title really meant something. The fast turnover in more recent years makes it obvious, Richard, that it's a different world on Comer Hall's main floor. At a time when tenure is measured sometime in months and years, certainly not in the decades anymore. Funches was described as a no-nonsense, morally strict, dogmatic, set in his ways scientist and administrator. But he could change his mind, as he did when convinced of the need for a more diversified agricultural economy. His leadership led to research in livestock and poultry production, which proved to be extremely valuable to Alabama down the road. And he was ahead of his time when he took an administrative stand that led to fish pond research at Auburn, a decision that made possible one of Ag Hill's greatest success stories. There was never any doubt who was boss of Ag Hill when Funches sat behind that huge pockmarked desk overlooking Ag Hollow. Funches had broken an agreement that no one else on campus would have the title of director. That's why when the Wildlife Research Unit was established in 1935, the top administrative position was known as leader. The title director referred to Funches only, and everybody knew that. A belief still exists among some Ag Hill old-timers that Funches' unbending moral standards totally changed what was to be Auburn's fisheries program. Guyton, who had begun fisheries work in 1931 with his interest in collecting and identifying Alabama fishes, was considered the logical choice to head that new work. The only problem was that Guyton was divorced, and the dean simply couldn't bring himself to promote a divorced man. And how this situation changed what was to follow, nobody knows, but there's been much speculation about it. Homer Swingle, who received the mantle from Funches and went on to earn an international reputation in fish culture research and development, reportedly called Guyton the father of fisheries in a public meeting before an Agency for International Development group. Now, with my high regard for Dean and Director E.V. Smith, there's no way I could leave him out of this discussion of Ag Hill personalities. But he earned his spot on the list for two reasons. Most importantly, he had left a record of 48 years of productive service as student, teacher, researcher, and administrator. Besides that, he just looked like a dean to me. Also of importance as far as legends are concerned, his personality and habits make him an interesting character. If searching for the perfect example of Auburn loyalty, E.V. Smith would jump to the top of the list. I vividly remember his story about telling his wife to be Martha North when he joined the faculty that $3,600 would be the top salary at Auburn. And as he said, if we can't be satisfied with that, I'll just have to leave. But there's no doubt he came to Auburn to stay. His salary kept pace with the times, of course, but Auburn is fortunate that E.V. Smith never really considered working anywhere else but Auburn. The same could be said for many of Auburn men and women who came to stay and help make the agricultural programs what they became. Dean Smith's legendary tight-fisted money policy is well illustrated by his reaction to a motel room's reservation that confirmed a higher rate than he had seen the meeting announced for him. In a follow-up later, he stated, and I quote, "I asked you to reserve a minimum price single room for the nights of December 2 and 3. You confirmed a $13.50 room, whereas the meeting announcement had indicated the minimum rate at $12. I will appreciate you reserving me a room at the lower rate per night." How many administrators would have time to do that today? In my earlier years in Comer Hall, when U.S. mail service left Auburn by train, I was often enlisted to hand-deliver special mail to the mail car to assure quick delivery for Dean Smith's letter to some state official in Montgomery. Give the porter this dime was his usual directive as he handed me the coin and the letter to take to the train station. Now, the other side of my topic, politics, will be short because of time constraints. Nevertheless, a hint of what might be expected in the future showed up at the organizational meeting of the new college's board of directors. And that first controversy concerned who would be named agriculture's representative to the board. Governor Robert B. Lindsay presented his nominees for the 10-member board, but in a strange way. His list showed 9 individuals by name, with the 10th member to be president of the State Agricultural Society. 2 men claimed the post, Samuel Reed and B.S. Bibb, with Reed being the governor's choice. Resolutions favoring each of the 2 candidates were tried, but neither carried. The governor even tried a resolution saying that neither Reed nor Bibb was entitled to a seat on the board. It too failed to pass. But those in attendance had one more ploy. They simply ignored the agricultural seat vacancy and proceeded to do business with a 9-man board. Now, one of the more colorful trustee fights occurred in 1846, following the election of James E. Big Jim Folsom as governor. The new governor was angry because Extension Service had actively supported his opponent, Joe Poole. Folsom had beat him, but he still was wanting his pound of flesh. So he decided to fill a trustee vacancy with anti-extension people. He nominated Gould Beach, editor of Southern Farmer in Montgomery, who was widely criticized as leftist, Reuben Wright of Tuscaloosa, and Guy Lynn of Huntsville, who worked for FDR's Farm Security Administration, an agency I understand opposed by both Extension and Farm Bureau. Although not confirmed by the Senate, Folsom nominees were seated with the trustees at the meeting and joined in voting on these resolutions. Big Jim even used his visit to Auburn to speak to the students and try to enlist them to support his stand. But a court case filed by State Farm Bureau Chief Walter Randolph put Folsom on the defensive. He quickly called a special session of the legislature to confirm his nominees, but with no success. Ignoring Folsom's nominees, the lawmakers considered and confirmed V.S. Summerlin, W.L. Parrish, and Reedus Collier for the vacant seats, and reappointed Earl Salman and Frank Sanford to serve another term each. None of the 5 trustees supported Folsom or voted to censure Extension, which gave Extension a resounding victory following various charges of irregularities. Throughout Egg Hill history, playing of the game of politics has been essential for the college and experiment station to compete for various sources of funding. And the administrators who are remembered as being successful were also recognized as accomplished politicians. The names of E.B. Smith and Dennis Rouse immediately jumped to mind, though their styles were different. Dean Smith was especially successful at getting support from Washington, using an annual congressional day to bring lawmakers to Auburn for a look at research underway and to meet faculty. The regular fishing trip to North Auburn he put on during those gatherings in the 1950s and 1960s was a winning touch with the visiting congressman. Auburn's fisheries research lived or died on external funding, and E.B. played the game well, as did his successor, Dennis Rouse. While I would not low rate the success of Homer Swingle and Wayne Shell, both of whom were masters at selling their program to granting agencies, I think it's safe to say that Smith and Rouse were the dynamic duo that got most of the funding grants for fisheries. Dennis Rouse was in his realm when dealing with both state and federal officials. Some of his political victories during his 1972-81 tenure are legendary. Among these were the securing of the E.B. Smith Research Center at Shorter, the Seed Technology Center at Auburn and Headland, the Solon-Dixon Forestry Center at Andalusia, and the backdoor funding for upgrading the Ham-Wilson Livestock Arena. He also provided the final political push for the USDA forestry building that his predecessor had been pursuing for several years. The story of how Rouse secured a state appropriation to upgrade the outdated livestock arena is a testament to his ingenuity and to his political friendships. This was a year marked by an agreement between Auburn and the University of Alabama that neither school would ask for earmarked funds for any purpose during the legislative session. But Rouse's friends in Montgomery pulled a rabbit out of the hat. They added funds for the needed renovation to an appropriation to the State Department of Agriculture and Industries. The department passed on the funds to pay for the upgrade, which avoided Auburn's breaching of the agreement. Rouse's efforts to see Vice President for Agriculture in Sanford Hall was realized early in the Funderburk administration when Stanley Wilson was named VP for Agriculture, Home Economics, and Veterinary Medicine. But this was a temporary victory that was quickly overturned in the administrative reorganization during the Martin administration. He also lost the battle to maintain forestry as a department in the College of Agriculture. He tried to name the College of Agriculture and Forestry and Biological Sciences, but the Alabama forestry lobby was too strong, resulting in the creation of the School of Forestry early in Martin's administration. Many Ag Hill observers believed that Dr. Rouse was fortunate to be directed under President Harry Philpott, who allowed him to pursue his own dreams of development so long as he was a team player. Under President Martin, Rouse might have been prevented from independently pursuing support for many of the Ag Hill projects he had been able to sell. Although this is just a smattering of the political events relating to agriculture, it's all the time I've got. I did want to mention a few of them. They are quite interesting. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you this afternoon.
Between Auburn and the University of Alabama, the history of the political rivalry, which predates the football rivalry, by Anthony Donaldson, who's a doctoral candidate in history under Wayne Flint. So that should be interesting as well. But if you have questions, go to the microphone and bring them to us. The first question I have, it follows on some of the things that I want to talk about tomorrow. But I was glad that Gene Stevenson brought up the fact that the political arena is part of higher education, particularly state-supported higher education. And I want to talk tomorrow about an individual who I would argue surpassed even some of those that Gene mentioned in that game, and ask him at this point if he has anything to add to that that important topic of our ability to interpret what we do to legislators and governors and people who write the checks, as well as our patrons, the taxpayers of Alabama.
Well, I think that is one of the hardest jobs that administrators of research, extension, or teaching programs have to deal with. It's not necessarily what you're doing, but what people see you as doing. So it takes a very keen approach to that sort of thing. I just mentioned there are a lot more, and the one you're going to talk about was a master at it. But we've had some good ones, and you look back through at those that were not very successful as administrators, and that was one of their problems. They couldn't sell themselves and their program to people. So that's a topic in itself.
I might add, of course, I knew Dr. Duncan and his niece, who was a good friend of my late wife. But Dr. Duncan, in my estimation, was a par excellent politician because he was entirely a people person, not only with the constituents out in the state, but with the students. One example, I remember we didn't have sidewalks, very few sidewalks in front of Sanford Hall. And one of Dr. Duncan's statements was that he would build a sidewalk wherever the students made a trail. So that's one way we got all this maze of sidewalks in front of Sanford Hall and over the campus. But he was a very personable person. You meet him, I don't care who you were, he would stop and talk to you. And I loved the man. A lot of people did.
Got a granddaughter in school? Other questions?
I don't have a question, but I do have a statement to add to Gene. I think it was Gene's comment. Whoever said that Dr. Carey had an altercation with one of his employees. That was Dr. Luke, who was a kind of Carey slave. Actually, he worked for the university, but he did awful lot of things for Dr. Carey outside of the university too. And Dr. Luke was taking a little nap up on Carey Castle next to the Carey Pick Halliday home on North College Street. He was taking a little nap, and Dr. Carey was concerned that he wasn't getting his money's worth out of Dr. Luke. So he went up to try to push him along, and the story is that he swung at him with a hammer, but I think that may be a slight exaggeration. But anyhow, he swung at him, and he fell off, and he broke his leg, and he wasn't about to go to the physician in town, so Dr. McAdory fixed it for him, and Dr. Carey limped the rest of his life. That was true.
Questions, there are refreshments.
Thank all of you for coming. Appreciate it.